Michael Collins sat alone in his study on a crisp autumn evening in 2020, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he opened the leather-bound journal he'd kept hidden for over 5 decades. At 89, the weight of what he'd carried all these years felt heavier than ever. The forgotten astronaut, as they called him, knew his time to share the truth was running out. His thoughts drifted back to that pivotal morning of July 16, 1969, when everything he understood about humanity's place in the cosmos would change forever. The pre-launch sequence at Kennedy Space Center had begun like any other mission, but something felt different. While Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin received the lion's share of attention, Collins noticed unusual activity among senior NASA officials. Hushed conversation ceased when he approached, and classified briefings seemed more frequent than usual. Dr. Eleanor Matthews, a quantum physicist whose presence at a lunar mission puzzled him, had pulled him aside just hours before launch. "Commander Collins," she'd whispered, pressing a small device into his palm, "if you encounter any anomalies while alone in orbit, use this. Trust your instincts, but trust the data more." Before he could question her, she disappeared into the labyrinth of Launch Complex 39A, leaving him with an instrument he'd never seen in any NASA inventory. The morning of the launch brought an ethereal fog that clung to the massive Saturn V rocket like a shroud. During the final medical checkup, Collins noticed his heart rate was significantly lower than his crewmates', a calm that would prove crucial in the hours to come. As they suited up, he caught Armstrong staring at him with an uncharacteristically intense expression. "Mike," Neil had said, "sometimes the most important part of a mission is what goes unrecorded." At the time, Collins had dismissed it as pre-launch jitters. The ascent itself defied everything Collins had experienced in training. As they breached the atmosphere, the command module's instruments registered a momentary energy surge that didn't appear in any subsequent mission logs. Mission Control's response was oddly muted when he reported it. "Copy that, Columbia. Proceed as planned." The typically chatty communication channel fell silent for 11 seconds, he'd counted them. As Earth shrank behind them, Collins began noticing subtle discrepancies. The stars looked somehow sharper, more numerous than any previous orbital flight had revealed. The onboard cameras periodically malfunctioned, but only when pointed at certain sectors of space. Most troubling were the whispers, fragments of conversation that bled through his radio when they passed certain points in their trajectory, voices that didn't belong to any known mission personnel. Dr. Matthews' device, carefully hidden in his personal effects, had started emitting a faint blue pulse shortly after their first orbital insertion. The readings it displayed contradicted everything he thought he knew about space, time, and humanity's first journey to another world. As they approached lunar orbit, Collins realized why he'd been chosen as command module pilot, not just for his technical expertise, but for his ability to keep a secret that would shake the foundations of human history. The true weight of his responsibility became clear during a private communication from Mission Control, transmitted on a frequency he'd been quietly instructed to monitor. "Columbia, be advised, Protocol Omega is in effect. Acknowledge with 3 clicks if you understand." His hand had hovered over the transmitter for what felt like an eternity before he responded. Those 3 clicks would bind him to decades of silence. That evening in 2020, as he finished documenting the events of that first day, Collins glanced at the worn device on his desk, still functioning after all these years, still confirming what he'd witnessed. His decision to finally share the truth would either vindicate half a century of speculation or forever change humanity's understanding of that historic mission. As he sealed the journal entry, a familiar blue pulse reflected off his window, reminding him that some truths come with a price that only time can justify. The real story of Apollo 11's launch day, he knew, wasn't just about 3 men leaving Earth, it was about 1 man being chosen to carry a burden that would outlive them all. As he prepared to document the next phase of his extraordinary journey, Collins couldn't help but wonder if the world was finally ready for what had really happened during those 21 hours he spent alone, orbiting the dark side of the moon. 72 hours into the Apollo 11 mission, as the lunar module Eagle separated from the command module Columbia, Michael Collins entered what would become the most isolated period any human had ever experienced. Alone in Columbia, orbiting 60 nautical miles above the lunar surface, Collins initiated what appeared to be routine systems checks. But as Eagle's signal grew fainter, the mysterious device Dr. Matthews had given him began pulsing with increasing intensity. The first anomaly occurred during his third lunar orbit. The familiar static of space communication suddenly crystallized into what sounded like Baroque music, specifically, Bach's well-tempered clavier. Collins initially attributed it to fatigue, but the device's readings spiked correspondingly. He meticulously documented everything in a separate journal, using a code he'd developed during his Air Force years. As Columbia passed behind the moon for the fourth time, completely cut off from Earth, the craft's internal environment shifted subtly. The temperature gauge remained steady, but Collins felt a distinct warmth on his left side, as if sunlight were streaming through a window, impossible given his position in the moon's shadow. The stars visible through the command module's windows began to move in ways that defied both Newtonian physics and his years of astronomical training. The device revealed patterns that suggested something extraordinary. The dark side of the moon wasn't just a visual phenomenon, it was a threshold. Each orbit brought new readings that indicated the presence of what Dr. Matthews notes called temporal discontinuities. Collins discovered that certain areas of lunar orbit experienced time differently, with his chronometer and the ship's atomic clock occasionally disagreeing by several seconds. During his 15th orbit, while documenting these temporal anomalies, Collins witnessed something that would haunt him for decades. In the darkness below, a series of lights appeared on the lunar surface, forming geometric patterns that corresponded exactly to the mathematical sequences the device had been recording. These weren't reflected sunlight or camera flares, they moved with deliberate precision, forming and dissolving in sequences that suggested intelligence. The real shock came during Orbit 17. As Columbia emerged from behind the moon, Collins saw what appeared to be another spacecraft, one that matched no known design, Soviet or American. It maintained position relative to Columbia for exactly 108 seconds before vanishing. The device's readings during this encounter filled 3 pages of his coded notes, and the electromagnetic readings it recorded defied everything he knew about physics. Collins made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of reporting these events directly to mission control, he encoded them within routine status updates, using a predetermined set of phrases that would only make sense to Dr. Matthews and her team. The burden of this knowledge was tremendous. While his crewmates made history on the lunar surface, he was witnessing something that suggested humanity's greatest achievement might actually be its entry into a much larger, more complex reality. The solitude became both blessing and curse. Without witnesses, Collins could observe and document freely, but each new discovery amplified his isolation. The device revealed patterns in space itself, suggesting that the moon's orbit might serve as more than just a gravitational boundary. The mathematics behind these patterns would later become part of a classified report that influenced decades of space policy, though few knew of its true origin. As Eagle prepared to rejoin Columbia, Collins faced his greatest challenge. The device had revealed something about the moon's relationship to Earth that, if made public, would force a complete re-evaluation of human history. The reunion with Armstrong and Aldrin approached, and with it, T. Would you like me to continue with Part 2, Solitude Above? 72 hours into the Apollo 11 mission, as the lunar module Eagle separated from the command module Columbia, Michael Collins entered what would become the most isolated period any human had ever experienced. Alone in Columbia, orbiting 60 nautical miles above the lunar surface, Collins initiated what appeared to be routine systems checks. But as Eagle's signal grew fainter, the mysterious device Dr. Matthews had given him began pulsing with increasing intensity. The first anomaly occurred during his third lunar orbit. The familiar static of space communication suddenly crystallized into what sounded like Baroque music, specifically, Bach's well-tempered clavier. Collins initially attributed it to fatigue, but the device's readings spiked correspondingly. He meticulously documented everything in a separate journal, using a code he'd developed during his Air Force years. As Columbia passed behind the moon for the 4th time, completely cut off from Earth, the craft's internal environment shifted subtly. The temperature gauge remained steady, but Collins felt a distinct warmth on his left side, as if sunlight were streaming through a window, impossible given his position in the moon's shadow. The stars visible through the command module's windows began to move in ways that defied both Newtonian physics and his years of astronomical training. The device revealed patterns that suggested something extraordinary. The dark side of the moon wasn't just a visual phenomenon, it was a threshold. Each orbit brought new readings that indicated the presence of what Dr. Matthews notes called temporal discontinuities. Collins discovered that certain areas of lunar orbit experienced time differently, with his chronometer and the ship's atomic clock occasionally disagreeing by several seconds. During his 15th orbit, while documenting these temporal anomalies, Collins witnessed something that would haunt him for decades. In the darkness below, a series of lights appeared on the lunar surface, forming geometric patterns that corresponded exactly to the mathematical sequences the device had been recording. These weren't reflected sunlight or camera flares, they moved with deliberate precision, forming and dissolving in sequences that suggested intelligence. The real shock came during Orbit 17. As Columbia emerged from behind the moon, Collins saw what appeared to be another spacecraft, one that matched no known design, Soviet or American. It maintained position relative to Columbia for exactly 108 seconds before vanishing. The device's readings during this encounter filled 3 pages of his coded notes, and the electromagnetic readings it recorded defied everything he knew about physics. Collins made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of reporting these events directly to mission control, he encoded them within routine status updates, using a predetermined set of phrases that would only make sense to Dr. Matthews and her team. The burden of this knowledge was tremendous. While his crewmates made history on the lunar surface, he was witnessing something that suggested humanity's greatest achievement might actually be its entry into a much larger, more complex reality. The solitude became both blessing and curse. Without witnesses, Collins could observe and document freely, but each new discovery amplified his isolation. The device revealed patterns in space itself, suggesting that the moon's orbit might serve as more than just a gravitational boundary. The mathematics behind these patterns would later become part of a classified report that influenced decades of space policy, though few knew of its true origin. As Eagle prepared to rejoin Columbia, Collins faced his greatest challenge. The device had revealed something about the moon's relationship to Earth that, if made public, would force a complete re-evaluation of human history. The reunion with Armstrong and Aldrin approached, and with it, the need to maintain a facade of normalcy, despite what he'd witnessed. In his final hours alone, Collins prepared 2 sets of mission notes. The official version contained the expected observations of a command module pilot performing his duty. The second, encrypted and miniaturized using techniques Dr. Matthews had taught him, contained the truth about what he'd seen in those lonely hours orbiting the moon. This second record would remain hidden for over 50 years, its revelations deemed too profound for a world still grappling with its first steps into space. As Eagle approached for docking, Collins made one final entry in his coded journal: "The moon isn't just a destination, it's a doorway. And we're not the first to find it." The device's blue pulse faded as his crewmates returned, but its implications would illuminate the rest of his life, leading to the moment when, decades later, he would finally decide to share the truth with a world he hoped was ready to hear it. The discovery phase of Collins' hidden Apollo 11 narrative began during Orbit 23, when the mysterious device's readings reached unprecedented levels. The quantum signatures it detected suggested patterns that defied conventional physics, patterns that seemed to respond to human consciousness itself. During this critical orbit, Collins documented a series of inexplicable phenomena that would later become known in classified circles as the Collins anomalies. The command module's instruments registered gravitational fluctuations that shouldn't have been possible, while the device Dr. Matthews had provided showed mathematical sequences that perfectly predicted these variations seconds before they occurred. The most startling discovery came when Collins noticed that these anomalies corresponded with ancient lunar maps he'd studied during mission preparation. Specific coordinates, dismissed by NASA as cartographic errors, aligned perfectly with the temporal distortions he was observing. His military training kicked in as he methodically documented everything, knowing that each observation could be crucial to understanding what he was witnessing. The device revealed something even more extraordinary, evidence of what Dr. Matthews had theorized but never proven. The moon's orbit contained regions where spacetime itself seemed to fold. These quantum corridors, as Collins would later name them, appeared to be artificial constructs, suggesting an advanced civilization had modified the moon's natural properties for purposes unknown. Collins faced an ethical dilemma that would haunt him for decades. The data he was collecting contradicted everything humanity thought it knew about space exploration, lunar history, and possibly human origins itself. The implications were staggering, evidence suggesting that the moon's position and properties might not be entirely natural, that its relationship to Earth might have been engineered for a specific purpose. Using the device's advanced sensors, Collins mapped these anomalies, creating a three-dimensional model of what appeared to be a vast network of quantum corridors surrounding the moon. The pattern was too precise to be natural, too complex to be coincidental. But the most troubling discovery was yet to come. During Orbit 28, Collins detected a signal emanating from deep within the moon itself. The device's readings suggested it was some form of quantum entanglement beacon, operating on principles far beyond current human understanding. This discovery forced him to make a decision that would define the rest of his life. Collins knew that revealing this information immediately could derail not just Apollo 11, but the entire space program. The Cold War tensions of 1969 meant that any suggestion of advanced technology or artificial structures on the moon could trigger an international crisis. Yet keeping this knowledge secret felt like betraying every scientific principle he held dear. He spent hours encoding his findings using a cipher system Dr. Matthews had prepared, embedding the data within routine mission telemetry. The real challenge came when he had to decide how much to share with Armstrong and Aldrin upon their return. The weight of this decision was compounded by another discovery, evidence that similar quantum signatures had been detected by previous lunar missions, but never reported. The device's readings peaked during Orbit 32, revealing what appeared to be a mathematical sequence embedded in the very fabric of space around the moon. This sequence, when analyzed later by Dr. Matthews' team, would prove to be an exact match for certain mathematical constants found in ancient megalithic structures on Earth. Collins made his final recordings as Eagle prepared for its return journey. He carefully documented how the quantum corridors seemed to pulse with energy as his crewmates approached, suggesting some form of intelligent design that responded to human presence. The implications were clear: humanity's first lunar landing might have triggered something that had laid dormant for millennia. As he prepared for reunion with Armstrong and Aldrin, Collins encrypted his most sensitive findings into a format that would remain undetected for decades. The device, its purpose now fulfilled, was secured in a special compartment designed to shield its energy signature from NASA's post-mission inspections. The discovery phase of Apollo 11's Untold story concluded with Collins recording one final observation: "We came to the moon seeking knowledge of our past, but we may have uncovered a window into our future." The question isn't whether we're alone in the universe, it's whether we've ever been alone at all. This part of Collins' secret would remain buried until 2020, when advancing technology would finally allow for proper analysis of the quantum data he'd collected. The implications of his discoveries would challenge not just our understanding of space exploration, but the very nature of human civilization itself. The communication blackout during Apollo 11's mission marked the most intense period of Collins' secret experience. As Columbia entered its 33rd lunar orbit, all radio contact with Earth suddenly ceased. Not just official NASA channels, but even Dr. Matthews' encrypted frequency went dark. What followed was an event that Collins would only fully document decades later, during his final years. The command module's electrical systems began exhibiting unexplained fluctuations, while the mysterious device Dr. Matthews had provided started emitting a high-pitched frequency that matched the mathematical sequences previously detected in the quantum corridors. In complete isolation, Collins witnessed what he would later describe as a temporal window, a distortion in spacetime that manifested within Columbia's cabin. Through this phenomenon, he observed what appeared to be historical events on Earth's surface, spanning different periods. The device's readings suggested these weren't hallucinations, but actual glimpses through time, enabled by the unique properties of lunar orbit. During this blackout period, lasting exactly 147 minutes, Collins experienced what he called the convergence. The command module's instruments registered impossible readings, zero gravity despite maintaining orbital velocity, temperature fluctuations that defied thermodynamics, and radiation patterns that suggested the presence of particles unknown to modern physics. Most significantly, Collins encountered what he cautiously termed the observers. Through the temporal window, he saw beings that seemed to exist simultaneously across multiple dimensions. Their form was incomprehensible to human perception, but their presence was undeniable. The device recorded their interactions with the quantum corridors, suggesting they were somehow involved in maintaining these structures. The psychological impact was profound. Collins later wrote in his encrypted journal, "How does one maintain sanity when confronted with evidence that everything humanity believes about its place in the universe might be fundamentally wrong?" He employed his military training to remain focused, methodically documenting everything while maintaining enough composure to eventually resume normal mission operations. During this blackout, Collins made a discovery that would influence space exploration for decades to come. The observers appeared to be monitoring humanity's space endeavors, using the moon's unique position as a vantage point. The quantum corridors weren't just passages through space-time, they were part of an ancient surveillance system, predating human civilization. The most challenging moment came when Collins realized he was being directly observed. The beings seemed aware of his consciousness, initiating what he could only describe as a download of information directly into his mind. This data dump contained mathematical concepts that would later be found to correlate with breakthrough discoveries in quantum physics decades later. As the blackout period neared its end, Collins made a series of rapid-fire observations that would take years to fully decode. The moon's orbit wasn't random but precisely engineered. Earth's development had been monitored for millennia. Human consciousness could interact with quantum phenomena in ways science hadn't yet discovered. The Apollo missions had triggered some form of preset protocol within this ancient system. When communication finally resumed, Collins maintained his composure, reporting only standard mission parameters to Houston. But the device had recorded everything, its quantum memory storing data that would eventually reshape our understanding of space exploration. The most haunting aspect of this period was the message Collins received just before communications restored, a series of mathematical equations that, when finally decoded in 2020, appeared to be coordinates for future human space exploration, including locations that wouldn't be discovered by astronomers for decades. This communication blackout became the cornerstone of Collins' secret, the moment that transformed him from an astronaut into a reluctant guardian of knowledge humanity might not be ready to handle. The experience left him with a profound understanding: Earth's moon wasn't just a natural satellite, it was a constructed vantage point, designed to monitor humanity's development until we reached a specific threshold of technological advancement. As Columbia prepared to reunite with Eagle, Collins made his final encoded transmission to Dr. Matthews' frequency: "The Watchers have always been here. They're waiting for us to understand why." This message, when finally decrypted, would become the catalyst for a new era of space exploration, one guided by the hidden knowledge of humanity's first lunar sentinel. The reunion between Collins and his fellow astronauts marked the beginning of what he would later call the Burden Years. As Eagle successfully docked with Columbia, Collins maintained a facade of normalcy while processing the extraordinary events he'd witnessed alone in lunar orbit. Armstrong and Aldrin noticed subtle changes in their colleague. Collins' typically precise mission notes now contained curious gaps, and his descriptions of the routine orbits seemed carefully measured. During their return journey to Earth, Collins documented their reactions to casual questions about unusual phenomena they might have observed on the lunar surface. Their responses, though seemingly candid, suggested they too might have encountered inexplicable events they weren't discussing. The post-mission debriefings became an exercise in calculated omission. Collins worked with Dr. Matthews to develop a system of reporting that would preserve the essential scientific data while obscuring its more extraordinary implications. They created two parallel records: the official NASA documentation and a shadow archive of quantum readings and temporal observations that would remain sealed for decades. During the worldwide publicity tour, Collins maintained his reputation as the quiet astronaut, but his silence now carried deeper significance. While his crewmates described their lunar experiences to captivated audiences, Collins carefully wove subtle references to his discoveries into his public statements, creating a breadcrumb trail for future researchers who might understand their true meaning. The device Dr. Matthews had given him remained active, continuing to detect similar quantum signatures at various locations on Earth. Collins mapped these terrestrial anomalies, discovering they formed a pattern corresponding to ancient archaeological sites. This correlation became part of a classified study that influenced space program decisions for the next 50 years. In private meetings with senior NASA officials, Collins presented carefully selected portions of his findings. The agency's reaction was revealing. Instead of dismissal, he encountered calculated interest. Several key figures showed familiarity with similar phenomena reported during previous missions. A secret task force was formed, with Collins as a silent advisor, to investigate what they termed lunar quantum anomalies. The psychological toll of maintaining this secret affected Collins profoundly. He developed a complex coding system for his personal journals, embedding his real observations within seemingly mundane mission recollections. These encoded messages would later prove crucial in validating the quantum data recorded by Dr. Matthews' device. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Collins worked behind the scenes with a select group of scientists who understood the implications of his discoveries. They developed theoretical frameworks to explain the quantum corridors and their relationship to human consciousness. Their findings influenced classified space research programs, though their true purpose remained hidden from public view. The most challenging aspect was watching humanity's space program evolve without the benefit of his hidden knowledge. Collins knew that the quantum technology he'd encountered could revolutionize space travel, but revealing it prematurely risked consequences he'd been warned about during his encounter with the observers. By the 1990s, Collins had established a network of trusted researchers who helped him monitor global scientific developments related to his lunar discoveries. When experiments in quantum physics began producing results that matched his hidden data, he recognized the approaching threshold Dr. Matthews had predicted. Humanity was beginning to discover independently what he'd learned in lunar orbit. His role as guardian of this knowledge transformed over the decades. From active concealment, he shifted to subtle guidance, influencing space policy through carefully worded recommendations and strategic consulting roles. Each advance in human understanding of quantum physics brought humanity closer to the point where his revelations could be understood and accepted. The burden began to lift in the early 2000s as private space companies emerged and new theories about spacetime and consciousness gained acceptance in mainstream science. Collins recognized the signs Dr. Matthews had described. Humanity was approaching the technological maturity needed to handle the truth about the moon's quantum nature. As he aged, Collins prepared for the eventual disclosure of his secret. He organized his encoded journals, collaborated with trusted scientists to verify his quantum data, and established protocols for releasing the information in a way that would minimize social disruption while maximizing scientific benefit. By 2020, with humanity on the cusp of a new era in space exploration, Collins knew the time for silence was ending. The burden he'd carried for over 50 years had served its purpose, protecting humanity until we were ready to face a more complex reality than anyone in 1969 could have imagined. Looking back on the burden years, Collins would later write, "Sometimes the greatest service to humanity is not in what we reveal, but in what we keep safe until the right moment." The truth about Apollo 11 wasn't just mine to tell, it belonged to the future. In 2020, as Michael Collins approached his 90th year, he made the monumental decision to reveal the truth he'd guarded for over half a century. His final confession began with a series of carefully coordinated releases of his encoded journals, synchronized with new discoveries in quantum physics that could finally validate his observations. The revelation process started with a private meeting of International Space Agency representatives, where Collins presented the complete data from Dr. Matthews' device. The quantum readings, preserved perfectly over 5 decades, aligned remarkably with recent discoveries in particle physics and consciousness studies. The scientific community was stunned to learn that Collins had documented quantum entanglement phenomena decades before their official discovery. Collins chose to reveal his truth through a methodically planned series of disclosures. First came the release of his enhanced mission logs, which detailed the quantum corridors and temporal anomalies he'd observed in lunar orbit. These revelations coincided with new telescopic evidence suggesting artificial structures within specific lunar coordinates, the same coordinates he'd recorded in 1969. The public reaction was seismic but measured, exactly as Collins had hoped. Modern understanding of quantum physics had prepared humanity for concepts that would have seemed impossible in 1969. His descriptions of the observers and their quantum surveillance system found surprising acceptance among both scientists and the public, particularly as supporting evidence emerged from other space programs' classified files. Perhaps the most profound impact came from Collins' detailed documentation of the mathematical sequences he'd received during the communication blackout. These formulas, when finally decoded, provided groundbreaking insights into quantum propulsion theory and spacetime manipulation. Private space companies and research institutions began incorporating these principles into new technologies, accelerating humanity's space exploration capabilities dramatically. The revelation about the moon's engineered nature and its role as an observation platform sparked intense global discussion. Collins worked with an international panel of scientists to present evidence supporting his claims, including correlations between the quantum corridors he'd mapped and unexplained anomalies detected by modern lunar probes. Dr. Matthews' device, preserved all these years, became the centerpiece of a new research initiative. Modern analysis confirmed its quantum sensing capabilities far exceeded current technology, raising questions about its true origin. Collins revealed his final conversation with Matthews, suggesting she might have been part of a long-term program preparing humanity for this disclosure. The most controversial aspect of Collins' confession was his detailed account of the observers and their apparent role in human development. His documentation of their nonlinear existence and their use of the moon as a monitoring station challenged traditional views of human history and evolution. However, his methodical presentation of evidence, supported by decades of covert research, made these revelations harder to dismiss. As his final act, Collins established the Lunar Quantum Research Initiative, a global organization dedicated to studying the phenomena he'd discovered. The initiative's first project involved creating a modern version of Dr. Matthews' device, using the original's quantum principles to advance human understanding of spacetime manipulation. The impact of Collins' confession extended beyond the scientific community. His revelations sparked a philosophical revolution in human self-perception. The knowledge that we had been observed and guided throughout our development led to new theories about human consciousness and our species' role in the cosmos. In his final public appearance, Collins addressed the world's leading scientists. The truth about Apollo 11 was never just about reaching the moon. It was about discovering our place in a universe more complex and interconnected than we imagined. The real giant leap for mankind wasn't landing on the moon, it was learning why we were drawn there in the first place. The legacy of Collins' confession continues to unfold. His revelations have fundamentally altered humanity's approach to space exploration and our understanding of consciousness itself. The quantum corridors he discovered are now central to new theories of interstellar travel, while his documentation of the observers has sparked a new field of study in quantum consciousness. As humanity prepares for a new era of space exploration, Collins' long-held secret has become a guiding light. His decision to wait until humanity was ready to handle these truths has been vindicated by the measured, scientific approach taken to studying his discoveries. The third astronaut's final confession didn't just reveal the truth about Apollo 11, it opened the door to humanity's next great adventure in understanding our place in the cosmos.